Good evening, everyone. My name's Carol Allman Morton, and I'm Ollie at Berkshire Community College's Executive Director. We're so glad to have you here with us tonight. As we begin, with gratitude and humility, we acknowledge that those of us in the Berkshires are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. I have a few short announcements and then we will get started. To learn more about programming at Ollie at BCC, you can check out our website, berkshireollie.org/events. I have a few to highlight tonight. Next Tuesday night at 7 p.m., you can come back to Zoom webinar for an update on Ukraine with Jim Brooke. We also have in March a number of workshops on organization, singing, and writing. And I encourage you to save the date for a talk with Sarah Vowell, who you may remember from The Incredibles and also NPR's This American Life. She's going to be coming on April 8th via Zoom to talk about her book Lafayette and the Mostly United States, which will help kick off an 18-month series of programs on the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's visit to the Berkshires. We also, in March, have 3 Distinguished Speaker Series lectures, one with James Ketterer from Bard College on Jazz Diplomacy, America's Conversation with the World. That's on campus at BCC on March 11th. Joel Wolfe from UMass Amherst has a talk on Zoom on the history of football, and that is on March 3rd. And Austin Serrett from Amherst College will be offering a talk called Is Democracy Doomed? And I want to promise that it won't be a bummer because Austin makes talking about legal stuff very fun. So I encourage you to come to that. And I forgot to write the date down, so we will put it in the chat. Also, if you're planning ahead, our spring semester of classes begins on March 31st, and our spring open house will be March 4th at 10 a.m. Now, we would like to welcome Dr. Tom Gerety. We're so grateful that Tom reached out last week and offered to help us navigate this complicated legal time in our country. Tom taught constitutional law through most of his career. He retired as Collegiate Professor of Law and Humanities at NYU. He headed up the Brennan Center for Justice and was president of both Trinity and Amherst Colleges. He has law and philosophy degrees from Yale. And I also want to thank Dr. Catherine Kidd, who will be helping with questions and answers when we get to that point in the talk. If you have questions that you don't want to forget, feel free to put them in the chat at any time, but we'll be holding them until after the lecture. Welcome, everybody, and take it away, Tom.
Thanks very much, Carol, and thanks to Kate Kidd for fielding the chat. And there are a lot of us on this Zoom, so she's going to amalgamate questions together if we have time, and I hope we do. I guess I want to pause just for a second. A lot of you have been thinking about fascism in relation to what's fascism in America, in relation to what's happening right now in this second of Donald Trump's terms as president of the United States. And I myself have mostly until this point played around with the term proto-fascism, meaning some kind of fascism light or something. Probably the closest analogy is the one that the Trump's most rabid supporters have taken on, and that is the Orbanism, or the Hungarian model of so-called illiberal democracy. But we do seem to be in the midst in these weeks of a shock and awe campaign that's designed to drive through a radical change, a reactionary change in American constitutionalism and American politics. I just want to take note of that. Others may differ. I don't myself think we've reached a Hitlerian point at all, but I do think we're getting very close to an Orban point. When you read about fascism in Italy and Germany and Spain and so on, the many features of it seem to come down to dictatorial authoritarianism, leaning towards totalitarianism, an expansionism in the European instances in almost every case, which we see now in this land grabbing notion in relation to Greenland and Panama and so on, even Canada, which you can't tell if it's a joke. It seems to me that the place that we ought to start today is not with the executive orders exactly, but with the pardons. The pardons of the January 6th convicts, really, and in almost every case, are, it seems to me, maybe the most fascist-like thing that has happened, because in effect, these are the militia troops, the sort of willing to use violence political activists behind Trump. And by freeing them, he has liberated them, as they say, to arguably indulge in violence in the years to come. When you have a president who'll pardon you for what was done and the policemen and others who died as a result of the activities of January 6th, you have a president who's willing to countenance a lot and even encourage a lot of violence. And I do think that's the most notable shock and awe in all of this, or shock, if not awe. I was teasing around with one of my grandchildren about the relation between awe and awful, and I think we're on the awful side of awe in this moment. So the pardons are perhaps the most notable thing to begin with. You all know they're in the Constitution, the pardon power. It's taken from monarchical traditions, especially in Britain, but to a larger extent in Europe and going back to the Roman Empire. They really are unreviewable. And though there is an office in the Justice Department that prepares and reviews pardon requests, I think it's very, very unlikely in our lifetimes that we'll see any serious constraint on presidents, whether President Biden with Hunter and some of the rest of his family and the congressional committee, and many others, or President Trump with his massive pardoning that includes so many people who use violence against the Capitol Police and others, and the Capitol itself. What we're here tonight to talk about, though, is the executive orders. And I want to just go through, many of you have asked outside of this forum, well, do they have the force of law? Do they have the force of the Constitution? Where do they stand in relation to other legal acts? And the quick answer is that they are simply presidential directives. And I'm going to ask Carol and the others behind the camera to show us the very first executive order from George Washington, which was phrased as a directive. So there you have, it's headed to the board of the Treasury of the United States. I think it was this is one example. The letter was sent to each of the offices. And gentlemen, he says, and they were all men, in the present moment, he describes himself as very busy and says, for the moment, though, before things really heat up, this is June 6, 1789, I'd like to ask you to keep me apprised, of what's going on, how you do it, how your office is organized. And that stands really as number one in the executive orders of the United States. Written to gentlemen, a very gentle request, and one that was honored in many ways in the weeks that followed, as the various officers of the government, as it grew, would report back to their chief executive on what was up. Carol, what's the next one that I have there in the list? I'm going to show you several executive.
Next is LBJ.
So this is a really important one because President Trump specifically and explicitly canceled it, if you will. This is in 1965. LBJ has all those papers on his desk and is talking to someone, but what he's working on, according to the photographer, is the original 1965 affirmative action order, ordering all the departments of government. He's the chief executive, just like George Washington, and he's saying, okay, I want everybody to, in your actions, in upholding the law, to also use what he called affirmative action. And the term at this point was understood in that to be outreach and recruitment. And he specifically mentions without regard to race, color, creed, and so on and so forth. So it was a moment in the development of affirmative action that's was controversial in its day, but was much less controversial, and was very, very much than it has been in the last number of years, as it went up to the Supreme Court and was turned away in its more modern form a couple of years ago. The next slide you have, Carol, and I'm going to let you throw the slides up. Here's probably the worst of our executive orders to this day. This is the Japanese internment order by FDR, arguably the worst thing he did as president of the United States, and I think arguably one of the worst things that ever happened in the United States to citizens and residents of the United States. We call it Japanese internment, but in fact it was to a large extent American internment, citizens being interned in all those Western and Southwestern camps that were built by the military to hold them, and were called at that point military areas. Carol, the next one. Well, the most famous and probably the most glorious in January of 1863. Here is a fancied up version of Lincoln's own writing, but the Emancipation Proclamation. As you know, he wrote it months before and edited it, but held on to it until the point in the Civil War where he felt it was irrefutable that the freedmen and women could help win the war. And it emancipated, of course, all those enslaved in only a part of what was to be the United States of America again, and that is the parts that had been conquered by taken over by Union forces against the rebellion. Next, Carol. And here is our friend Donald J. Trump as president number 45, January 27th, so just 1 week into his earlier term as president, signing that first Muslim ban. And that Muslim ban was stopped, enjoined in several courts, and another one was tried, also tested in the courts, and I think it was the third one that was cleaned up, if you will, to look less Islamophobic or less racist, and was passed by the Supreme Court. Notice the numbers, 13,769. So far, I'm not counting, but I imagine Trump is up well over 100 or 150 by now. But what happened was that back in the 18th century and the 19th century, they were not really numbered. And then there was a retroactive numbering that brought the numbers into the thousands. FDR being the champion of this, he had almost 4,000 executive orders. But Trump and others have certainly competed in that. And past presidents have had lots of executive orders. So where are they constitutionally and legally? They are directives to the officers of the government reporting to the chief executive to do this or do that or do something in a certain way. They join another facet of our legals. And by the way, I should underscore here, they have to meet constitutional and legal tests. They do not override statutes, and they certainly do not override the Constitution. But they have a tremendous power within the governmental structure, as we're seeing in these days, these kind of Alice in Wonderland days in which President Trump is declaring such things as energy emergencies when we're the largest producer of fossil fuels in the world and have some of the largest reserves in the world. There's a kind of Alice passing through the mirror so that up is down and down is up in a lot of what President Trump has to say and has been saying in his campaigns and rallies. And that shows in the 100 and some executive orders thus far in this 47th presidency. But I think it's impossible to understand our present moment without understanding a backdrop to executive orders legally, and that is the emergency powers that have been vested in the president. Elizabeth Goitein at the Brennan Center has become sort of the national expert on this, and she has a very good paper on the roughly 135 emergency declarations or powers that a president has. A few of them in the keep with the president of the Congress, but almost all of them leaving the president enormous discretion to do such things as impose tariffs, close the border, stop refugees, and so on and so forth. Many of them are trivial. They have to do with promotions and the use of various military officers. A lot of them are military. But fundamentally, when joined with the Alice in Wonderland of executive orders that we've had in the last 2 weeks, they leave our president in an extraordinarily powerful position in which only statutes of Congress or terms of the Constitution can stop him from deploying emergency powers through executive order and otherwise, like executive proclamations and declarations that have put us in the position as a country we are now, where I would say for myself, and everyone's entitled to their opinion, that we are in the midst of an Orban-like move towards illiberal or authoritarian democracy. And it could well slide down into fascism. I think most of us feel that as a fear. But it is clearly something many of us didn't perhaps anticipate. I myself had said years ago that Trump's kind of craziness and incompetence would hold him back. And it did in his first term, I think, but it did in the last couple of days, indeed, in the freeze. But whether it'll hold him back in the future and to what extent, I think none of us can say. What we can say for the moment is that while he has the Congress by a handful of votes, and while he has the Senate, and while he has the court itself by a super majority, he doesn't have an ability to override the 60 vote requirement in the Senate that can be stopped with a filibuster. And there does remain room in our political system for some resistance. I myself would say that Trump to today is behaving very much like the Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland. And what worries me is that in a quieter way, Chief Justice Roberts might behave in the way that Lewis Carroll described the King of Hearts, namely a quiet but ultimately complacent and get along, go along position. I'm hoping that that's not entirely true, and I'll talk in a moment about the birthright citizenship that a number of you have asked about. And I think that there we're going to see some resistance from the Supreme Court. At least that would be my sense of it. Let me say one more thing about emergency powers. There was in 1976 a National Emergencies Act that would have required that any emergency that was declared by the president would be limited in time to 2 years, and that in 6 months, within 6 months, Congress could object to it and vote against it by a joint resolution of the two houses that would remove the emergency powers. This was a law that in many, many ways made a lot of sense, but it was struck down in a small immigration case of a guy named Jagdish Chadha. Carol has a picture of him, who it was struck down in effect or as a precedent. You got Wong Kim Ark there. And Chadha was a fellow whose citizenship whose deportation had been stopped by Congress acting this way and stepping in a line item veto. And that bears some relationship to the president stepping in and impounding money that Congress has passed. But separation of powers, whether from the congressional side or the presidential side, has been held by the court to clearly put the requirement that if Congress is going to pass anything, it has to be by law, and if law can be vetoed by the president, and it has to be passed by 2/3 majority. And similarly going the other way. Nixon was a master of the line item veto, which is a kind of emergency power, and that led to resistance. And ultimately, the line item veto was struck down, and we'll talk about that when we come to monies. Now, the biggest exercise of emergency powers this time around really can be rested on several bases, and I would describe it as President Trump suggesting to all of us that we're in some kind of war, a war against immigration, a war on our borders, and then extending from our borders back into our states and cities. And the war, unfortunately, can be based, in Trump's mind, I think, is based on his powers under the guarantee clause of the Constitution to guarantee a Republican form of government against rebellion and invasion. It's also abetted by the famous Insurrection Act and the 1798, Alien Enemies Act, all of these are moments of crisis that were taken seriously by the framers of the Constitution and then by the Congress in handling things like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, the split in Rhode Island when no one could decide which government was really in charge, and so on and so forth. And the notion that the federal executive should have a power to step in times of real civil disturbance, insurrection, rebellion, or invasion, and exercise emergency powers. And of course, as you know, not only has he declared an emergency in terms of energy, he's declared an emergency in terms of the border and immigration. And on that basis, drawing on these powers, if you will, or on these conferrals of powers, he has said he's going to stop several things. One, all refugees entering the country, including those most of us feel are so deserving, namely the Afghan men and women who supported our no doubt wrongful war and fought alongside American soldiers in Afghanistan. He's going to stop, he claims he's going to stop temporary protected status for Haitians, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, and Cubans. He claims he's effectively going to just seal the border against all movement across in our direction. He's sending everybody back, including those who come most closely into the light of asylum international law, those who are persecuted by a government and seek shelter from that persecution, very much in keeping with the traditions from the Nazism in the Second World War, when international law declared the right of asylum, and when we signed on to it in those years and the years that followed. So Trump declares then, by the declaration of an emergency in these various ways, that he has these various powers. And he has an argument for that. And the question you will have is, well, what kind of limit is there on that? The National Emergencies Act is gone. The Supreme Court struck it down years ago. Will the court strike down some of these emergencies? And my own sense of that is that the majority of the court will not, of the Supreme Court will not. That is to say that they will say, as many of their predecessors have said, that determinations of emergencies under, say, the Guarantee Clause, guaranteeing a Republican form of government against or under the Insurrection Act, must be left to a political judgment by the highest elected official and the commander-in-chief. And I think they're very likely to bow down, at least the right side of our court. And I'm sure there'll be some resistance to it by the three liberals on our Supreme Court. And there'll be lots of different answers in the district courts and the appeals courts. But I think ultimately, his power to declare emergencies of this kind, even calling the border a setting of invasion, may well be upheld. There's a further kind of emergency power in here that we're all familiar with since 9/11, and that is terrorism and counterterrorism. Because President Trump has argued, and Stephen Miller and others around him have asserted, that the drug cartel violence in Mexico, spilling over the border in terms of drugs and so on, and indeed in terms of violence in the Southwest and the West to a significant extent, that these cartels do in fact are terrorist groups, and foreign terrorist groups that are so certified by the State Department. And again, the certification of terrorist groups by the President of the United States simply follows a very easy procedure since 9/11. He will go to the Secretary of State and say, take a look. The Secretary of State will examine, send some staff to examine it and come back and say, yeah, they're using violence for political ends and they're threatening our national security. And President Trump will certify them as foreign terrorist organizations. And there's just almost no appeal. It's a 5-year certification. It can be appealed. Were you to be certified that way, or I? But in the case of these cartels, there are several Democratic senators. I can think of Senator Blumenthal in Connecticut and others who think it's actually a good thing that we should certify them this way. It raises all sorts of ugly possibilities that Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, must fear in the back of her mind. And that is, as Trump has spoken of it, that the military will not just be at the border, but possibly be used to sort of intrude across the border into Mexico. Now, this militarization of the border includes, of course, the sending of troops to the border. And many of you will have heard of the Posse Comitatus Act, a post-Reconstruction, frankly, reactionary and somewhat racist move signed by Rutherford B. Hayes in the, I think in the 1870s, to say that the military would not be used in the governance of any of our states. And the understanding of the very terse language of the Posse Comitatus Act is that there, one, are exceptions. President, as you know, in the Little Rock desegregation fight, sent federally governed National Guardsmen into Little Rock to keep the peace, and they were armed. But on our border, we have developed over the years of what many would call a crisis, and I guess we could concede there has been a crisis at the border. The military has been at work on the border going way back at this point, certainly back to the Clinton administration, I believe, to the Bush administration. But the military there have been doing almost entirely support work, logistical work, fence building, truck driving, bus driving, and so on and so forth. What President Trump has suggested has so far not been that they'd be used as an armed force, except in relation perhaps to the cartels. But he has suggested that they'll be building these encampments and detention centers that he and Thomas Homan, the czar of these affairs, have insisted need to be built, and that we all know they simply will need more space if they're going to detain and then deport as many people as they are claiming, a claim that I don't believe is possible or feasible economically, but a claim that we see made daily and hourly from the Trump administration, from Stephen Miller, and from others. A feature of the border that has developed in the last several years, including during the Biden administration, is an extension of the border to almost everywhere. That is to say, the concerns of the sanctuary movement and others for ICE penetrating every corner of the United States, in effect, pulling border surveillance back through all of our cities and so on, is just a fact of life for undocumented migrants in the United States, and even many who are documented and whom in whose cases Trump is saying he'll take away the documents. So the border emergency, in quotes, is one that I fear President Trump will be able to make stick as a legal and conceptual matter under the Constitution, where I think there will be tremendous resistance and tremendous impossibility to do anything like what he's saying, is in the practicalities of it, the fiscal practicalities, the military practicalities, and so on and so forth. I, like many others, am very skeptical that they'll be able to deport even 1 million people. I think, we see them claiming these great removals at the numbers of 1,000, the military planes going to Mexico and to Colombia. I understand that those military planes are still deporting people who were detained by President Biden. So it's not clear to me that this will happen, but it is clear to me that the claim of emergency powers here is, I hate to say it, but very probably going to be upheld. A militarized border, I think, at least with troops not bearing arms against migrants, but doing work that will make it harder for migrants to get through, is, I think, a reality of at least these next 4 years and perhaps beyond. A number of you are involved in the sanctuary movement, and the question has arisen about the sanctuaries such as churches, schools, and hospitals that have been, and indeed cities that have claimed sanctuary powers. And I think it would be remiss of me not to say something about this to all of you. Some of you know a great deal about it, but the tradition of sanctuary churches, a medieval tradition that honored somewhat in the breach, but to some extent in Latin America and Spain and so on, has been revived in our setting in relation to migrants, and has had a lot of power in cities like New York and LA and San Francisco, a lot of sway. I fear that we've already seen Tom Homan say that in cases where he feels it's necessary, his ICE officers will in fact go into schools, will in fact go into churches, will in fact go in even to hospitals to seize people whom they identify as here without papers. That has been in the last 20 years or so a policy of our Customs and Border Patrol and immigration enforcement authorities, rather than a law. That is to say, there's been a kind of deference. It may be entirely motivated by PR, but there's been a sense of we don't want to make a show of capturing people in churches and intruding, breaking down church doors and so on and so forth, even if we have warrants. I think that's going to go by the by, and I don't think there's much we can do about it in legal terms. It has no real legal or constitutional status, and President Trump has an executive order entirely ridding us of it, and that's sad, but I think it is the case. Now, I want to turn, and I'm trying to move somewhat quickly, and I hope I'm doing it a little bit, to something that I know is sort of the most prominent issue in these days, and that is birthright citizenship. And Carol, I'm going to ask you to put up both the picture of Wong Kim Ark and then the 14th Amendment's Section 1 and Section 5 for everybody. So let's start with the 14th Amendment. Well, all right, Carol, starting with Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark was born in the 1870s. He was 10 or 12 when the Chinese Exclusion Act passed, but he was born on Sacramento Street in San Francisco to two people who were legally Chinese parents who were legally resident in the United States at the time of his birth. And thus, even though in those days visas were rare, residence in the United States was by no means as formalized the permit as a green card system, but nonetheless, he was born to people who had come to the United States to live and start businesses, and thus was an American citizen by the lights of the 14th Amendment. Let's turn to the language there quickly if we can. So Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, and you all know that this is the second of the Civil War amendments, and that it involves a kind of shift in the American understanding of our Constitution, in which the oppressions, depredations, enslavements, and so on of the various states were no longer to be allowed. Enslavement wasn't to be allowed, and the denial of citizenship was not to be allowed too. And here I'll read Section 1 with you. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And that last phrase is important because the Civil War was fought over the question of whether the states in which some Americans resided could deny the privileges and immunities, the rights of citizens to their people living there simply because of their race. And of course, we know the answer then, and this was a major change in the Constitution. The issue that had been sort of hidden away by the original framers was now by these new framers, people like Bingham from Ohio, really engineered a big change in federalism and a kind of a second revolution in which now the states would not be allowed to deny citizenship or rights to people residing within those states and citizenship to those born there. The problem here is that a group of lawyers, some very smart and some very fanatical, have seized on the language there, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizen of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And then goes on with the rights and liberty and property and so on, and due process and equal protection. Well, that phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, certainly was discussed as encompassing the children of diplomats. A French diplomat in Washington or New York who bore children within his family or her family did, and let's say I assume most of you have seen incidents of this. A diplomat's child has a car accident or something. What happens? Typically, they are not prosecuted in the United States. They are simply expelled. And so the first category here, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, would be that the persons born to diplomats recognized in the United States were not subject to our jurisdiction as a general matter, except insofar as they could be expelled. And those would be excluded from citizenship. The second issue, which is more sensitive, and I think we're all more alert to it nowadays, was that at this point, despite the oppression and persecution and destruction of our native populations, there was a legal sense, and there were treaties recording this legal sense, that the various Native American tribes were in fact nations and were to be respected as nations, or disrespected as nations, as the case may be. And they too were outside the jurisdiction of the United States. And so there too, their children were not citizens of the United States. And this only changed in the bunch of constitutional amendments and laws that were passed in the 10s and 20s, when we recognized that this system was in fact a continuation of an oppression, and that while being members of tribes and thus of treaty nations, they could also be citizens of the United States. And that is in fact the case today. So what's happened is that, starting with a very good immigration lawyer who considers himself kind of a moderate, named Peter Schuck, who had his office next to me at NYU, because a lot of Yale law professors, which he was, don't like living in New Haven. Peter and another Yale professor, a political scientist named Roger Smith, wrote a book in the 80s and then wrote several articles and op-eds saying that they saw a path towards eliminating birthright citizenship by emphasizing subject to the jurisdiction thereof and taking it as applying to those in the country illegally. There was argument at the time of the framing of the 14th Amendment that invading armies and so on and so forth, it wasn't just diplomats and Native Americans who had been discussed. There were also questions, sort of highly technical questions. Well, what if an army invades and they have some of the people in the army have children? Are they citizens because they're on our territory? And the answer was no, because they weren't subject to the jurisdiction thereof. So Peter Schuck and Roger Smith caught the attention of people who were wilder and crazier, like John Eastman, now disbarred. And this became a part of a reactionary and very right-wing notion that Congress might extend subject to the jurisdiction thereof to the children of those who have no documents or no legality, if you will, to be in the United States. And if you go down to the 5th section of the 14th Amendment on this page, you'll see Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Well, this is where I do think Trump will fail, because frankly, the filibuster, which I'm glad we have at this time, will prevent him from getting any legislation to this effect, I'm hoping, through the Senate and probably through the Congress as well. What he has sought to do is to have this effected by an executive order, We've already seen that it's been enjoined by one district judge. No doubt it will be enjoined by others. And as time goes on, it'll make its way up to the Court of Appeals and probably quickly to the Supreme Court. My hunch is that this Supreme Court, without congressional legislation of the sort that Peter Schuck imagined, will not approve this. And I would guess it would not approve it by a vote of at least 7-2. And you all know who the two are who would seem to be voting with Trump whenever they can, or we're voting with the authority of the unitary executive and authoritarian president whenever they can. But I have some confidence, I'd say a modest degree of confidence that even that middle group of on the right of justices, Kavanaugh and Barrett and the Chief Justice, would vote against it. And certainly our three liberals on the Supreme Court would vote against it. So I don't believe Trump will succeed here. And it's probably the most important executive order that he's handed out in these last 2 weeks. And I believe we'll win on it. The Wong Kim Ark went to China as a young man twice. The first time he got back into the United States, into San Francisco port, fine. The second time he was grabbed by the customs officers and jailed in the port with it denied, in effect, entry formally. And that's what led to the Wong Kim Ark case. And he won. And he won with a pretty conservative court that some year in that same vicinity of time settled on separate but equal as proper constitutional rule. So it wasn't as if we had some kind of 1890s court that was super liberal. But the precedent has been very strong. It's been mentioned in dicta and Supreme Court cases since, and I think it will withstand Trump's challenge. And it's probably, as I said, the most important thing that has happened here, perhaps after the pardons. Now, a bunch of things have happened in the last couple of days in which Trump has been freezing money allocated by Congress in past years, particularly in the Biden years, and also reviving his notion of going after the civil service. So let me take those as two different units. Freezing money already allocated by law by the Congress is a violation of the power of the purse, namely that language in Article 1 that says, and Carol could throw it up here if she wants, or if she has it to hand, that says that Congress, that the duty to pay taxes, imposts, and so on, and so to impose taxes, imposts, to pay debts, and to provide for this common defense and the general welfare belongs in Article 1, the congressional article, to the legislative branches. I think that will be upheld. It's been upheld numerous times before, but I don't think it will go without some challenge and some dissent. And so I believe that as a general matter, President Trump will not be able to impound large amounts of money. There may be delays, there may be adjustments, there may be other things he can do. He did it already using some military funds for the wall, quote unquote, last time. But I think he will be resisted here, and I think he will lose ultimately. But I say that as something of a prayer as well as a conviction. On the federal civil service, the Schedule F, which has now changed its name to Policy and Career, a very odd termination, a term for it. Schedule F, as you know, he tried to impose last time, and that would make thousands of federal employees in the senior ranks, below the senior ranks, fireable. Right now, all the assistant secretaries and so on and so forth, the great 2,500 or so senatorially approved people are fireable at will in most of the offices and departments of the federal government. But he wants to in effect, pull that down. Some have said as far as 50,000 employees. There are roughly 3 million federal employees. More than 1 million of them are in the military. A lot of them are unionized, and a number of them are civilian employees, even at the Defense Department. I think one of the largest numbers. So his notion here is that by executive fiat, by an executive order, he can simply reclassify, rework the federal classifications. And it's arguable in my mind that he could. However, the unions have contracts and they will resist him. Most people in the, many people in the federal government, I think the majority, and he's not, of course, going after the military in this particular regard, are going to be in a position to simply say no. Now, there's a buyout going on for the moment in which he's offering anyone who wants to retire within the next 8 months, as you know, 8 months salary for, I gather, doing nothing. And I have no idea what will happen there. Some of you may have an idea. I assume some people are going to retire in the next year. Will say, fine, I'll take the free money and take a vacation. But whether this will give him thousands of open spots, I just don't know. What I can say to you is that since the 1890s, we have had a civil service with civil service exams, and it's been an almost universal consensus, as they say about the movies, that this has been a good thing, that it would eliminated the spoils system, that we weren't just putting in our nephews or our buddies into these various intermediate positions in the federal government, and that the federal government wasn't being corrupted by a cronyism that we see so rife in Trump's approach to economic affairs and indeed to governmental affairs. There'll be a lot of resistance. The unions will put up a real fight. But I do believe he'll be able to lower through this notion some of the classifications and start removing people and putting in his people. We've already seen in the Justice Department and elsewhere, he's running a kind of witch hunt for anybody who cooperated with the Biden, anybody who worked for the Biden administration, even in ordinary positions where they were somehow involved in an investigation of Trump's criminality and so on and so forth. So this particular emergency order, I think, is really quite dangerous. How far it will go, I'm fearful that it will go a fair ways. I don't think it'll go to 50,000, but of the employees, but it might go to several thousand, and that would be an astonishing doubling of the political appointments in our government, and I suspect would lead to a good deal of corruption and incompetence. That's certainly the feeling that most Americans have had going way back through the progressive era. I think the federal civil service is going to be fearful. I think it's going to be hounded and harassed. I think there will be firings like the inspectors general. What's happening now is that a lot of the executive orders, like and declarations, like the firing of the nearly 20 inspectors general, are done without observing any of the procedural rights. So there'll be litigation and it'll be held up. But over time, I think the Trump administration will learn to handle that. Now, there are other things I could mention here, claims about Greenland and Panama. One feature I think is really important economically is Trump's favorite word. I laugh because it's actually an Arabic word, al-tarifa, meaning a regulation in Arabic, or tariffs. Yes, emergency imposition of tariffs is a power the president has, and he has it in several regards, and he has declared an economic crisis, and so he's going to do it. One of the strangest things in this whole thing is this Alice in Wonderland. For instance, the proclamation or executive order on weaponizing justice. Trump is the master of weaponizing justice, but he's got an order that says that he's going to investigate the weaponizing of justice. And most of us who are cynical about this feel that the order on investigating weaponizing injustice is a kind of a, I don't know what, a smoke screen that doesn't conceal much for actually weaponizing justice and weaponizing firing and so on and so forth. Now, finally, and maybe the most consequential thing in the long run, is climate. And I already said at the beginning, he's declared an energy crisis, and he's declared it like the Queen of Hearts. It's a crazy energy crisis. We have no energy crisis in the sense that we're running out of energy. What we have is an energy crisis in which we're burning too many things, oil and gas and so on, coal and so on, to have our energy. And we're doing it at the highest point we've ever done it. But that climate crisis that Trump has declared will involve a good deal of litigation about whether he can draw back some of the legislation, much of the legislation that's involved in President Biden's achievements for climate in his vexed and difficult term as president of the United States. And here I think there will be mixed results. He will not be able to impound the money. There will be political resistance to impounding it where it's to be spent in various states. And he has an obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And thus he cannot, in principle and in law, impound it. But I suspect he'll have more leniency from the courts than most of us would think fair. And I think he will be able to stop some of it. The role of people like Elon Musk in his administration is frankly frightening and does seem to be reflected in a number of things here. The sudden comments about China that sounds as if all of a sudden China is our great friend, having heard so much against China during the campaigns. We may be seeing a rerun of his friendliness with Putin and Russia here. I think probably that's enough, and we should open this up as much as we can to questions. Alice says in Alice in Wonderland at a certain point that she sees 6 impossible things before breakfast. And I guess I'd say we're seeing 1,000 crazy things before 2 weeks are out on this presidency, and return to the question, where are we headed and how can we stop the direction in which we're going? We are at risk of losing the real freedom and decency, the kindness and equality of our democracy. And it may well be that we're at risk of what Hungary has suffered, namely an authoritarian using democratic means, winning the electoral college as well as the popular vote, to impose denials of freedom of the press, cruelty and meanness to those both seeking work and free lives in America, and indeed on whom we depend in our elder homes and factories and farms. There will be real world consequences, I'll predict, with a lot of others. And I do think there are risks of massive inflation and real problems with our economy if Trump were to push through what he says he's going to push through with these emergency powers and executive orders. I don't think in the end he'll be able to push them all the way through, but maybe for him, headlines and a little show and tell cruelty will accomplish what he wants. I really can't predict that, but I think I can answer some questions about constitutional law and statutory law in relation to these things. And so, Kate, let's open it up to any of the themes that you've picked up in the chat.
We have a lot of questions in the chat and more coming in by the minute. But there were a number of questions at the beginning. You didn't really address this, but the actions by President Ford and then by President Biden with preemptory pardons of people. The questioner is concerned about what would happen if Trump took this approach, and how could that threaten situations that we're in.
And I do think this is, well, let me tell an anecdote. Adelia was reading about the mathematician Gödel, and I forget if he was from Germany or Austria, who went supposedly, and I have no idea if this is true, with Einstein to his naturalization swearing and hearing, I guess swearing in. And Einstein is reportedly said to have restrained Gödel because Gödel turned to Einstein and said, the American Constitution has a big loophole in which dictatorship can arrive and oppression. And Einstein said, shut up, Gödel, because if you say that, they won't give you citizenship. And what was the loophole but the pardon power? In other words, the president sends people out to commit crimes. This year, he has the immunity decision, which is capacious enough. But with the precedent of the pardon power, Oliver North and the militias, the Proud Boys, all sorts of things could happen. States could prosecute, but federal prosecutions could easily be null and void, either prospectively or retroactively by a president as undisciplined and frankly unethical and illegal as Trump. I think he seems to have shown himself perfectly willing to countenance gross abuses of just civility and decency in pardoning people who are responsible ultimately for the deaths of some of those Capitol policemen. So I think I did address it just very briefly, but just to repeat, the pardon power is effectively without constraint. It's a kind of oddity in the Constitution, which was written so much against the King of England, the kings of England. But in this regard, there was a sense, well, we ought to have a kind of grace or mercy and so on. But it goes back to that whole question. I know Ollie had a talk with Jeffrey Rosen about the Virtues book that he just wrote, drawing on the framers' interest in Aristotle and Plato and the Romans and so on. Also slave societies, I should say. But nonetheless, this sense that the framers were virtuous men. And we have a very, the proper word is vicious man, in my opinion, in the presidency. And there is Gödel's great loophole. He can use it, and he has used it already. And so now he knows how to use it. And the immunity decision really is another, just almost an add-on to that. It's another feature of that loophole. It's very parallel. And it was argued in the Circuit Court of Appeals in DC that what happens if SEAL Team 6 goes out and kills and is told to kill somebody, a political opponent, and then the president pardons him? Well, the immunity decision, vague as it is, by Chief Justice Roberts, seems to tolerate that kind of use of at least the president would be freed of any guilt. So next question. And I can help you if you like. I can move over.
Oh, Kate, you're muted.
Who's muted? Kate's
Okay,
muted.
she's on.
I'm muted. Sorry. Is there, I know you've sort of touched on this, but if the president declares an emergency that isn't an emergency,
like the energy emergency,
what is the path forward to prevent legislation or further executive orders or actions that might implement that policy, even though there's really not an emergency?
In other words, let me put this very generally. Can a president of the United States, under the Constitution and laws of the United States, conjure an emergency?
Exactly.
And thereby then declare it with an executive order or an executive memorandum, and thereby trigger emergency powers? Answer from me, yes. And what can stop it? Only throw the bum out and or get Congress to pass laws overriding a veto, presumably, to tighten what the procedures. The Brennan Center has a whole reform act that is proposed very impractically for the moment to reform our emergency powers. We have let emergency powers run wild, tariffs being a humdrum, but very important example. As somebody, as one of the economists has said in commentary, it's easy to impose a tariff. It's very hard to remove it, because once you impose it, whoever it is, the farmers, the steel makers, whoever enjoys it, the union, whatever, wants to keep it on. And so I think this emergency powers thing is another of these, what you might call defects or capabilities. You were talking about that word earlier, Kate, in the Constitution, that is just, we really need to change, but we don't right now have the political power to reform it.
Okay, thank you. There's the question which you've already touched on, but where are the lines with the Impoundment Act, and whether a president can essentially throw out the budget? So can you try to narrow that down a little bit?
Yeah. The Impoundment Control Act, like the line item vetoes, is valid law and would prevent typically impoundment. However, it's very clear from some litigation in lower courts particularly, that some flexibility, whether with an assertion of emergency power or special needs, as for instance, the military budgets were, how would I say, torqued or twisted so that he would have more money to build more wall in the last term that he held.
Yes.
There is, I think, likely to be some flexibility about expenditures. The question that arises is really, can he just cancel something, as he is now canceling a number of things, and say, well, that's the end of that. Now, what happened, one of the notions we've had about President Trump is that his incompetence saved us from his villainy the last time around. And the question is whether he has learned his lessons. Stephen Miller and all these people are sort of tutored and smarter and better lawyered and all the rest of it, and they'll do better. I think the last, I guess it's 36 hours with this crazy, again, Alice in Wonderland freeze, where, oh, if you read the memo, everything from the Office of Management and Budget, everything's frozen. It seemed like, oh no, not everything, individual things, military things, Medicaid, Medicare, which, by the way, RFK Jr. doesn't even know the difference between them, that which ones of these are and are not. And the pretty well-spoken young press secretary is out there sort of defending Trump and saying, well, not that, not that, not the other. And now it's all, the freeze is sort of off as far as I can tell, or at least a lot of it is off. So we're seeing a good deal of crazy incompetence of Keystone cops running around and not sure where they're headed. But once they settle down, I think they're going to try to impound, and they're going to be a real contest. And that's where I'm not really so confident as I am about birthright citizenship that it'll survive a visit to the Supreme Court. There, of course, is an argument, very prominent for the last 10 or 15 years among reactionaries, I refuse to call them conservatives, and right-wingers, that the executive power should be concentrated in the president, should be unimpeded by others, except where Congress legitimately passes a law or the Constitution prohibits something. And that argument could lead to a decision. Let's write in our minds a right-wing decision on this. The decision would say the executive too has some, despite separation of powers, has some power over the purse, namely the power of expenditure. And that would make null and void the Impounding Control Act. So I'm not sure. I think that it will survive again. It's in a visit to the Supreme Court. I suspect that middle group, Kavanaugh, Roberts, and the chief, maybe Gorsuch, Barrett certainly, would be very resistant to overthrowing this sense of the power of the purse resides in Congress, and Congress passed a law, and it's a law, gosh darn it, and the money should go there, to whether it's CHIP Act or what have you. But we're only seeing, that Roosevelt had almost 4,000 executive orders. We're going to see an awful lot of executive orders in the coming weeks, and some of them may get more refined. And I think we'll see some visits to the Supreme Court. And this impoundment question is one of the major ones that will go to the Supreme Court. President Trump is going to try to say the laws that preceded me shouldn't govern me, and he's going to, and the way I'll handle that is either declaring an emergency or impounding the monies and refusing to spend them, or both.
Okay, there are a number of questions related to what's happening with government employees.
Yes.
And I think there are sort of three that go together, so I'm going to try to combine them here. One is, how robust is the civil service, are the civil service laws? Number two, Penny Barker pointed out that when we've had government shutdowns, in order to pay staff when the government comes back online, there has to be an act of Congress. She's asking if these buyout proposals for employees to retire and take a buyout, that's not something that's been passed by Congress. And would Congress need to pass something to approve that? And going to the shutdown to the parallel. And then is the so right now we have this pressure on the top executives, but do the union contracts for civil servants at the lower levels protect them both from breaking their individual contracts to be able to work remotely, and the potential to force them out of government service through other means,
or make it difficult, or
yes.
I'm no expert on this, but I have tried to inquire somewhat, listening to podcasts and so on. Let's take first the big issue of remote work. President Trump, like a lot of corporate executives, wants less or no remote work. There you have two categories of people. One, you have people who are genuinely, who have been certified as in need of an accommodation, people who are disabled in some sense or have special needs. And
yes,
those accommodations, while they can be re-argued or reopened in argument, are strong and involve civil rights legislation going all the way back to the 80s and 70s, the Disabilities Act and so on. I think that group of people will be protected. I think the union people, which is a good hunk of the civilian federal government, with their contracts will have protection that has some duration. And I don't know the length of these union contracts, but let's assume some are 1, some are 2, some are 3 years to play out. There will be protections there. And then the civil service acts, which are numerous, will no doubt often offer procedural protections. The problem is, if any of you remember the great, recall the government employment of the great scientist James Hansen, who's been one of the pioneers on climate change, they simply put him in a place where he wasn't really doing his work. And this is happening with CDC and others. They can make life miserable for professionals, experts in the government, make it that their expertise is of no use or garners no respect and so on. So I think he can do a lot of damage in the civil service. I would remind everybody that there are roughly 2,500 senatorially confirmed positions. And in almost every recent administration, it's taken quite a while simply to get the people in those positions. So while Trump is paying all this attention to these senior staff, and senior staff, by the way, just below the senatorial confirmations, can be fired at will. So it's really after senior staff that you get into the hundreds of thousands of federal employees. And I just think, as with the deportation of the millions of people who don't have good documentation of their visa or don't, have not the documents for residence in the United States, we're going to see practical near impossibility to do as much as they are claiming to do. What's scary about an Orban-like administration is it seems to have ensconced itself in a permanent or semi-permanent majority. And we know with gerrymandering and so on how that's done here as well. That's, to me, what's scary. I don't think one term of this president will entirely wreck the civil service of the United States. It'll do some damage. But the real harm in this entire enterprise for the moment is for the poor people who are going to be treated so cruelly and meanly and viciously, really, accorded no respect for the fact that they're doing good work in most cases, committing fewer crimes than the rest of us and so on. I think they are the ones who are going to suffer. And I don't think all of them will suffer fear and all sorts of harms to their sense of themselves. But there'll be hundreds of thousands, no doubt, in these 4 years who will suffer much worse than that.
Okay, there are a number of questions here about sort of women's issues or gender issues. And one of the questions, a lot of them have to do with the idea that Trump is pushing that from the moment of conception, gender is fixed.
Right, we totally neglected this, and the DEI and civil rights executive orders, which are directives to heads of departments, right? And so and we'd have to go through them in detail. Well, let me go through a couple of them with you, Kate. If have you finished your question?
Yes. No, go ahead.
So my understanding, and I have not had experience of this, is that the passport offices and others are either have begun accommodation or are accommodating gender preferences, as they are in the Nordic countries and so on. That can be eliminated as quickly as the Gulf of Mexico can be called, the Gulf of America, or Denali can be switched back to McKinley. In the DEI area, what we have is we have two things really going on: eliminating various positions, which I gather are policy preferences within the departments. Oh, we need somebody to do this, let's set up an office of, without congressional authorization, without any special legislation. I could be wrong about that, but that's certainly my impression. So he can sweep away most of the DEI training and others as discretionary spending within the Treasury or the Justice Department or whatever. He's more ambitious than that and wants to go, I think, much further than that, and going after, quote, woke ideology, historical, all sorts of teaching. This raises the question that I just touched on with the sanctuary cities. Trump can't force San Francisco or LA to say we're no longer sanctuary cities in any legal sense, but he sure has some big hammers of funding, as we're seeing threatening with the LA relief. He can almost everything in our states in this modern day and age has federal funding attached. So I, as a college president, there were Pew grants and there were loans and faculty who had research funds. When I was in my law professor days, including my last gig, there was the resistance by law schools to recruitment by military. We don't want military interviewing our students on campus. Well, the Solomon Amendment came over and basically was willing, the Congress was willing to cut off all student loans and so on, and any kind of research funds, which are more modest in a law school. And to my knowledge, every law school had to capitulate. In other words, you don't want to hurt your students by taking away all their things over the simple question, can a recruitment officer come to one of your classrooms as opposed to a hotel off campus for interviews? There is huge power in the federal government to say to California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and so on, you either do this or you're going to lose that bridge. You're going to, prospectively. Now, the impoundment would not allow him to do this retrospectively, but prospectively, there's huge power in the federal government. And the interesting question that comes up here, in which the conservative members or the right-wing members of our Supreme Court have been among the leaders, is the notion that the federal government shouldn't commandeer the police and the officers of government in the cities and towns that are resistant to the deportation campaign. And there, I think we have a very good chance of winning. In other words, it's one thing if you send 100 ICE officers into Berkshire County or Columbia County. It's another thing if you tell us that all of our state troopers and so on and so forth have to work for you. As long as the state governments are resistant, I think that notion that you shouldn't be, federalism requires that the federal government respect the sovereignty and independence and discretion of state officers. I think that will be upheld, but there's a tremendous leverage in the money for education, I mean, I don't know what the percentages are, but I would guess that the budget of the Chicago schools, for instance, is very significantly federal, and so on. And it would just be devastating to actually wield that hammer. Now, that would require Congress. And so far, with the filibuster, he does not have 60 votes in the Senate for these sorts of oppressive measures. And maybe he'll have fewer in the Congress come 2 years from now. But I mean, let's hope. But that's what's scary about Orban, because Orban, bit by bit and year by year, has taken over, as I understand it, the various, both the press and the the parliament, and so on and so forth. So that Hungary is really, if you will, under a net of authoritarian power, even though it does have votes in elections.
Okay, I am going to, so Ed Lane posted something that, so there were 3 new executive orders while we've been talking. This on education, seeking to control teaching on race and gender, to change the funding of federal or state funding for schools to be able to go to private schools, and also to be able to deport foreign students who engaged in pro-Palestinian protests. So because you've been a university president, I'm going to privilege this question. And then we have a number of questions of people asking, what can we do? Is there anything we can do? Do you have suggestions for us? So let's go to the education question first, and then to pick your brain on what regular citizens can do.
So on the education question, the money, the big bat of money that he can swing is powerful almost everywhere, including, I regret to say, in universities. It's true. I mean, I wasn't a university president, I was a college president. And it's true in a private liberal arts college, there are not such great funds coming from the federal government, but there are significant funds nonetheless. And he does have these great hammers that he can hammer on people over time if he has the support of Congress. Now, remember impoundment. I mean, I think there will be resistance among Republican congressmen and senators to notions of some kind of political favoritism with who can get a Pew Grant to go where, and so on and so forth. We see in Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, a number of other states, that when you have a state governor and a state legislature that's willing to impose these kinds of restrictions, we are left essentially with 1, the teachers' unions, 2, some First Amendment arguments, 3, some discrimination arguments, and so on and so forth. I mean, the Civil Rights Acts now do apply in employment to people who are trans, to people who are LGBTQIA, et cetera. So there is plenty to litigate about. I don't know if that entirely answers it. At this point, we seem to have more than half the states, and that's not necessarily more than half the population, that are enough Trumpified that we will see textbooks that are extremely sanitized with respect to American racism, the arguments about genocide with respect to the native population and so on. So I think a lot of bad things will happen, and Trump will encourage him, and his leadership will have a real bearing. But no, I don't think it's going to go easily in many of these things. And I think there'll be a lot of resistance in the liberal states, and there are a lot of liberal states too. And so that's what I would say. Now, the one thing I noticed, Ed Lane, who's an economist, with whom I often correspond and whose writings I read, Ed makes the point that the economic, we've seen it in the papers 50 times, if we've seen it once in the last day or two. If the stock market fails, if inflation rises quickly, if the tariffs cause real, I don't know, potato growers in Idaho, if different groups, soybeans are no longer sold to Brazil, or China doesn't import this or that. This is a very complicated game. It invites corruption because we know Trump is going to favor the Teslas and the businesses of the people who support him with money and friendship and so on. And as I said earlier, you impose a tariff, great. Lifting it is what's hard. Taking it off is what's hard. There are going to be real world global consequences and American consequences of all of these moves. Adelia and I were talking earlier, and she was saying, do people on the deportation side of this argument about the undocumented not realize that our roofs, our nursing homes, our poultry farms, our dairy farms, that you just go through the entire country, and in so many industries, a third, a half, the plasterers, these people are on the whole not committing crimes and are a real foundation of our economy, and it will be devastated. We will become more and more, as Japan and South Korea are suffering, the birth dearth. We will not have enough young people. America now does not have a growing population if we exclude immigration. And we certainly need a good population of young people, whether or not you believe we need a growing population. I mean, I think we do, but there are plenty of people on the left and right who don't. But we certainly need a lot of young people, and we are not producing them in our own homes, despite some of us who have a lot of grandchildren, and so on. So I think there's a huge issue there, and I think there are a lot of practicalities. Trump is going to be stumped in some regards, but he's going to get away with cruelty, meanness, corruption, and I think some significant erosions of our resistance, erosions of our democratic protections against authoritarianism.
Okay, so I know we have 8 minutes left. What can we do?
Well, Kate, you could answer that as well as I could. I mean, the main activism in politics seems to be our main avenue. You and I had a little discussion earlier in the week about the Biden presidency and whether or not he bore some responsibility for this very modest difference in votes in the swing states, leading to this massive difference in the prospect of good lives for these many, many people who'll be deported. And for many of us who aren't going to be deported, not many of us listening here, but for the poor, for many people, this is going to be a very tough time, in my view, and I think for most of us. So activism number one. I have said that by hook or by crook, and I suppose sometimes by not asking too many questions, many of the people who've done contracting around our house have been people that I have a hunch are undocumented. And yet they've done very good work, and I've befriended them, and I've done some tutoring and so on. I think we just have to reach out to those who are going to suffer and do what we can and combine that with activism of whatever sort we have. We clearly face a situation, and I know we're speaking here as liberals and people who are either close in the Democratic Party or close to it. And I don't mean to entirely leave out, good Republicans and so on, but we face a really tough situation. So many of our neighbors, I live in a town that is very purple and divided. And so many of our neighbors, including some very highly educated and intelligent neighbors, somehow thought it was better to vote for this man who really, to me, looks like an utter disgrace in the seat of George Washington, but to them looks like a refreshing, breaker-upper of the consensus and router of the establishment. So that's really all I could say, Kate. I mean, do you have more to say? I think Ollie plays a small part. We should all be aware and alert and educated, but I think we should all be active too. We shouldn't be hobbyists, as that political scientist has argued, of politics in which we simply inform ourselves and then go sit by the fire.
Yeah, so I think I agree. We have to move beyond informing ourselves, but I think we have to start with informing ourselves. And I want to go back here because there were a couple of questions that are easy to answer. One is, we are not the only country that has birthright citizenship.
Right.
Trump said that. That is not correct.
That is flatly, well, let's say what it is. Canada and the United States are, I think, at one on this. If you look at the map, and you can find it in a minute by Googling it or by searching it, all of the Americas and the Caribbean
Yes.
have some version. It may be limited, it may have different aspects, but some version of this birthright citizenship. And in our case, it was enshrined in one of the, arguably the most important part of the Constitution, in the 14th Amendment. What tells us that we all have due process and we all have equal protection also tells us that if you happen to be born here, lucky you, you're a citizen of the United States.
Okay. In addition, there are many countries in Europe, Luxembourg, for example. I happen to know this because we have an extended family member who lives in Luxembourg, that children of people who gain Luxembourg citizenship through naturalization, children under 18 automatically get derivative citizenship from their parents. So essentially, it's a quite expansive definition of who are citizens. So I think we've also got questions here about whether the recording will be offered. So normally what happens with these kinds of presentations is tomorrow you will get an email from the Ollie office with a link to the recording. And it will also be posted on the Ollie YouTube. So you just go to YouTube and search Ollie at BCC, and you will be able to see the recording. And
I'd like to say one thing. I don't know, and
yes.
It's been very, how would I say? It's been striking to me over the last several years when we talk about the United States of America and the drift towards reaction and authoritarianism. Polls showing that kids prefer, an iron-handed leader and so on. That, especially as a teacher, I step back and say, but it's happening, as you said a moment ago, everywhere. Now, everywhere. China, Korea, Germany, France. Musk was just speaking to the AfD in Germany, the proto-Nazi party there. what exactly caused it? Globalism, the rise of these highly specialized technical fields where people make fortunes, the shifts in economic power and social media power and so on. It's a blur in a way to us. The focus is foggy to me, but it's everywhere, and it's the human condition. We seem as a species, once we are as numerous as we are, to have a very difficult time making wise decisions. And the framers hoped that across this continent, which they had essentially taken from the Native Americans, that they would had devised a system of checks and balances and dispersal and so on that would save us. But that old saw that, when people are swayed the wrong way, no amount of laws and constitutional guarantees can really save them from themselves and their own choices. And so I marvel at it. It's a fascinating thing. It's not just America. It's tragic that it's here, but it's tragic that it's in all the places it is.
Yeah, in other places also. Okay, so there are a number of comments from people saying, watch what is happening economically, watch what is happening with the Fed, watch what is happening with the stock market, and people commenting that Congress may not be able to stop him, but the stock market and business people might be able to. So
Tell it
there's
to Herbert Hoover. Yeah, I hope so. I think he's a pretty sensitive character to vainglory, but he is also a guy who's capable of imagining, as I said about Alice, a lot of impossible things that simply aren't true.
okay. So for those of you who've joined us tonight, thank you very much for being here. When Tom called me to say he wanted to do this, I said, people are going to want you to do it more than once. So we have a temporary agreement that if things continue to be as, I don't want to use the word explosive, but as chaotic as they have been in these first few days of the new administration, that we will invite Tom back in another 100 days to comment on what is happening. So summarizing other people's things, watch the economy. It's the economy, stupid, and watch the courts.
Thanks very much. Thanks, and thanks to all of us, or all of you who've joined in here. And I know we had more people than left us room for real dialogue, but I'll be looking at the chat and trying to answer people, particularly personally too. And there is a recording here if anyone wants to share it with a friend. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for doing this. Keep up the fight.
Okay, and thank you so much, Tom, for all you do for us and for helping us to sort through these difficult issues.
Thank you
Good night.
both. Have a good night.
Good night.